Alright, so today we're covering the year 1863 and the war between the states. And the chapter, it opens up by saying the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, which was the first black regiment authorized by the federal government during the war. Well, the war had been going on for quite some time now. But why did Lincoln wait until 1863 to use blacks in his U.S. Army? And why did he is a question you want to ask yourself. Well, the North, and we'll get to this later, was really only fighting the war with one hand. And Frederick Douglass said this in his monthly and weekly newsletter. He said the North was only fighting the war with one hand, and that they had to untie the other hand, and the other hand was the blacks. So that is why Lincoln, or one of the reasons why Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, which let blacks into the U.S. Army. And this is in contrast to the integrated armies of the South, where blacks and whites fought side by side, and Northern or Union regiments fought in segregated units, and this would not change over the course of the war. So why would blacks fight for the South and proudly wear their uniforms at reunions after the war? Well, you got to think about it. It's about pride. They wanted to protect their families, and they wanted to protect their homeland from an invading army. And sometimes you want to fight for who you know and not for who you don't know. And you also want to remember that history is written by the winners, and we often don't get to hear this side of history in Civil War talk in today's age. So the Emancipation Proclamation also was mentioned in this chapter, and did happen in the year 1863. Now this happened on New Year's Day, 1863. Why is the date important, New Year's Day? Well, New Year's Day was New Slaves Day, and this was when all the slaves would be sold down at the market. And so it's kind of significant that, well, now it's their Freedom Day. It's New Freedom Day. And well, why was this done? Well, this was done. This is a great question. Why was it done? Many people, it depends on who you ask. You would get a different answer for who you ask. But this was done in part to strengthen the military in the North. That way that blacks would flee to the North. The thought was that they would flee to the North and enlist in the United States Colored Troops. And what else was Lincoln doing in 1863 to strengthen his military? Well, on January 4th, Lincoln ordered General Grant to rescind his Special Order Number 11, which had expelled all Jews as a class from his military department. So not only were blacks being allowed in 1863, now Jews were being allowed as well. And who was not fighting for the North? You also have to remember a lot of people were not fighting for the North, as they had a larger population, and almost all of the South's able men we would think would have fought. This was not the case in the North. The morale and the pride was different. So we can see this is the Columbia Rock, the Sea Rock. This is in Brooklyn here, or no, this is in the Bronx. It's on the Spoiton Devil, near the Harlem River here in Manhattan, just across the river from St. Peter's. And in 1863, the Ivy League boat races were still going on, and they went on in every year during the war between the states. So if there are Ivy League colleges having athletic boat races during the war between the states, we can come to make the conclusion that not all the able-bodied men of the North were fighting if they were having college athletics during the war. And we're not having college athletics during our war with the COVID-19, also known as coronavirus. So we can see that we are fighting our war with two hands, and the North fought the war with one hand tied behind its back for most of, if not the entire war, because the Ivy League boat races went on throughout the duration of the war. The North did start a draft process, but it also allowed for substitutes, as we can see the same thing happening in the South. And the chapter also mentions the troubles of the South during this time period. The Richmond Bread Riot. This was on April 3rd, and here's the scene. And this is the bread riot in Richmond. And the soldiers dispersing the mob. This is because there was a shortage of food because the South was running out of resources, unlike the North, who never really had this threat. They had draft riots, but they certainly wouldn't have had these Richmond bread riots that Virginia was having, as the South was being blockaded and their ports being blocked, and they were feeding such a large army that they were having shortages for the civilians. And also the death of Stonewall Jackson happens in the year 1863. He was actually accidentally shot by Confederate pickets, so friendly fire. The general survived, but he lost his arm to amputation. Weakened by his wounds, he died of pneumonia 8 days later. And here we have some very cool pictures of Stonewall himself. He was on the $500 bill in the Confederate States of America. That's now worth a lot more money than $500. And here we have a nice local Georgia site. This is Stone Mountain. This is one of the great sites of the world, one of the 7 wonders of Georgia here. Here we have Robert E. Lee, Jeff Davis, and Stonewall Jackson. This is a statue that is an acre in size. This is the largest monument in the world, I think, a largest stone engraving on marble. Certainly one of the greatest things you can see with your own 2 eyes, and strongly encouraged by all people if they ever come down here to Georgia. And Stonewall, these are some great pictures I was able to take on my way home, escaping the coronavirus or COVID-19. I stopped here at Stonewall Jackson death site in the middle of Virginia. This is Jackson's sick room, actually. I got to see this, and this is where he spent his last moments alive, very sadly, but very low-key site there in Virginia. Another interesting thing that happens in 1863 is Lincoln and General Burnside have Clement Vallandigham arrested. He was a former congressman arrested for speaking out against the war effort in Ohio. So he was, even though he was a Northern Unionist, a person living in the North and part of the United States Union, he was arrested for speaking in favor of the rebels and against the Union war cause. So he was suspended of his liberties as an American, and we can start to see this happening in the COVID-19, also known as coronavirus war. They're trying to test limiting people's personal liberties, such as going outside, traveling, going to parks, and congregating in large groups, or groups over 10 people. As you can't have a protest with 9 people, can you? Or you can't have a lot of organized thought or discussion in person without being monitored. You see, all of our meetings are on Zoom now, so that they are, in the cloud, as we would say. They're in the cloud, so all our thoughts are now in the cloud. We are not allowed to congregate in groups over 9, and we're not supposed to travel outside of our home. So, suspension of liberties during wartime is a idea that started during the war between the states, and we can see an example of it here with Clement Vallandigham arrested for speaking out against the war effort in Ohio. And we have the Battle of Gettysburg. There's some cool pictures of Robert E. Lee here. Well, Lee actually tried to bring the fighting to the North, but this did not work out. This was his second time trying to come into the North. He tried to go into Maryland earlier in the war, but this also did not come out well. We also have the famous Pickett's Charge here. That was a failed attempt of the rebels or the Confederates running up a hill, maybe Cemetery Hill. I got shot down in droves, lost many men. This ends Lee's campaign into Pennsylvania and results in Lee retreating to Virginia. And this also concludes, a couple days later with the famous Gettysburg Address by Mr. President Lincoln. Then we have the Battle of Lookout Mountain is mentioned here at the end of the chapter. This is another really cool place if you're ever in the South. This is in Tennessee. It's a very large mountain, one of the last large ridges or mountain ridges with a very high peak, summit, or pinnacle. You can see here by the artistry. This was a very important battle because this opened the gateway for General Grant and General Sherman to conquer the South. After this, they would go on to battle in Georgia, and we will probably get to this in 1864. We had the Battle of Atlanta, and then Sherman's March to the Sea. But this, we also have the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. They had to go over Kennesaw Mountain, which we might try to get some footage of that and include it in our next video. But it started with the Battle of Lookout Mountain, one of the last great mountains of the South. Georgia has mountains, but they're not, they're very different. It's hard to explain if you're not from here, but Lookout Mountain is taller than our Georgia mountains. And this was a great feat for the North to have conquered, the Army being such atop such a high place. This was a very hard battleground. If you read accounts from soldiers on both sides. They were just stunned. They were fighting on top of this mountain. As you can see, here's the battlefield. Here's the summit. And here's a nice illustration. And here's a cool battle map here of Lookout Mountain. And you can see that's the Tennessee River. So that is, I think that's the end of our PowerPoint today. But that was 1863. And next week we'll have 1864 perhaps. Thank you so much.